Many artists in the 60s were using music to forward the fight for social justice, and nobody was doing it better than Curtis Mayfield. By the time he released this song in 1970, he was already a civil rights icon. We are going to discuss this scathing commentary on life in the projects and Mayfield's place in American history. Welcome to episode number 4 of Song Voyage, and it starts right now.
Sisters, niggas, whiteys, Jews, crackers. Don't worry, if there's hell below, we're all gonna go.
What happens when a TV producer from Southern California and a political activist from the Bay Area get together to talk music? I have no idea, but here it is. Now, spanning the globe from San Diego to San Francisco, get ready to set sail on Song Voyage.
Welcome back to episode number 4 of Song Voyage. I am Todd Villalobos in San Diego, along with Mitch Oster up in the Bay Area. So far, we have talked about murder and necrophilia. We've discussed an emotional U2 anthem. We talked about an Iron Maiden classic, and now, finally, something with some actual substance and history, brought to us by Mitchell Oster. It was his choice this time. The Curtis Mayfield song, Don't Worry, If There's a Hell Below, We're All Gonna Go, from 1970. Mitch, thank you very much for this song. How are you doing?
Doing great, Todd. How are you today?
Fantastic. So, this is quite a song you've chosen. There's a lot to discuss here. What are your initial thoughts?
Well, you know, it's funny. This is a song that I really am surprised that I chose. I chose to be our second song that I picked. I expected to pick a different kind of song when I was making my original lists. This wasn't near the top, but as I went through and decided which song I wanted to go with, this just kept percolating back into my brain. I don't know if it's because we're in a socially aware state right now in the world of politics the way that it is and everything going on in the world, but I couldn't get away from this song. And I'm curious, actually, if you had heard this song before I sent it to you to listen to, how familiar you were with Curtis Mayfield in general, and after researching, did you maybe realize that you knew more Curtis songs than you had, and just basically, did you like the song?
My first reaction, I did not know anything about the song. I knew very little about Curtis Mayfield. I'm not a stranger to the genre, the funkadelic kind of the black 60s movement songs. I'm not unfamiliar with those. I do know a lot of them, but for some reason, I've never been familiar with Curtis Mayfield or his work. When I put this song on, the very first thing that happened was I got a huge smile on my face, because this is exactly the kind of songs that I love. These songs that kind of take you on a journey from point A to point B to point C to point D. It was incredibly creative. I loved it right off the top, and I can see why you chose it. And so I thank you. It's a great choice.
Yeah, it's funny. After I sent it to you about, I don't know, like a half an hour later, you sent me back a text that said, "Great choice!" exclamation point. And I realized that I was excited that you had immediately had a positive reaction. So I wanted to talk a little bit about Curtis Mayfield in general for those in the audience that don't know him and don't know his music, because he's not the biggest and most well-known artist from that era. So he had been in the Impressions, which was a very well-known band from the 60s and 50s and 60s. And, he had been the lead singer after another really iconic soul singer from the era, Jerry Butler, left the band and started his own band. This period that you talked about where he had already been a social icon, it's true. His song, People Get Ready, was a huge song, and it really was kind of a benchmark song of the social movement from the mid-60s and into the early 70s even.
So people get ready for the train to Jordan, picking up passengers cold
this song in particular, in this album that he created, which was his first solo album, it really upped the game on the social awareness and the social critique, really. Before, it was more of a civil rights anthem with People Get Ready. This was much more commentary on the state of our culture and our society. And so it was a totally different grade of commentary that was much more assertive and aggressive in terms of critiquing all the power systems in our society that kind of created this urban environment in the late 60s and early 70s. So it was less about civil rights and more about people's everyday lives. And I think that was the piece of this that really kind of grabbed me and always made me love this song so much. Bob Marley, everybody knows Bob Marley, and he had this big giant album called Legend, which I think most people who know Bob Marley know him from that album. It's a greatest hits, came out after he died. And on that album, there's the really classic song, One Love, which everybody knows. And the title of that song on the record, on the greatest hits album, is One Love / People Get Ready. And I was like, what is this? Why is People Get Ready in the title of that song? Because it's not like he does a medley where it's a live performance and he converts after, 2 minutes of One Love into some version of People Get Ready. It just was there, and I never understood why. And I didn't know the song at the time that I saw that. And I always wondered, what is this People Get Ready? And I looked at the liner notes and it says co-written by Curtis Mayfield. Well, years later, I discovered that there was actually a lawsuit because the writers of People Get Ready thought that he had ripped off some part of that song, and I guess they agreed, and they, like they do in a lot of songs, they ended up with co-writing titles. But this actually is in the title of the song, even though the Bob Marley song doesn't have anything to do with it directly.
Hear the children crying, saying, give thanks and praise to the Lord, and I will feel all right.
So someplace you can check out this similarity is at a great website called whosampled.com. I've used it in the past for other situations where I'm trying to figure out where two songs are similar to each other. Sometimes it's more than two, but if you go to whosampled.com and you search on both People Get Ready and One Love from Bob Marley, you'll find a side-by-side comparison where people have pulled YouTube clips of the songs and then bookmark these specific sections where there's a comparison between the two, so you can actually hear for yourself whether or not these are similar or whether they were sampled. And we'll put a link up to the specific page for the comparison between these two songs up on our website, songvoyage.net. That made me wonder, who is this? Who's Curtis Mayfield? I didn't know anything about him at the time. And after years of, kind of wondering about that People Get Ready thing, I came across his music and just was blown away. And of course, the song People Get Ready, which we talked about, but this album in particular is an incredible kickoff to a stretch of songs and albums from 1970 into the mid and late 1970s, where he just did over and over again, released masterpiece albums, which all touched on the same themes and had some of the similar musical style. And probably the most famous, of course, is Superfly, which is the soundtrack to the 1972 album. It was not a sequel to Shaft, but it did come 1 year after Shaft, and it was directed by the same director, and it had a lot of similar themes, and people have connected Shaft with Superfly in a lot of ways. There's a really important distinction, I think, that Shaft was maybe looking at some of these cultural issues in a direct way and just kind of saying that they existed, where with Superfly, Curtis took that to another level by critiquing those things that are happening in societies in a way that Shaft just didn't. It's kind of just a fun romp through black urban America. Superfly and the album and the movie a little bit are much darker and looking at much deeper meaning in some of these issues. So it was very exciting for me to kind of go back to this album that preceded Superfly and look at some of the earliest stuff that Curtis was doing to kind of get into this mode of doing a more aggressive social commentary. And I'm curious, what did you think about the content of the song? Like what were I mean, this opening, vocal track, which is just a woman speaking.
Last night I was so depressed, and I went and got the Bible, and I turned to the book of Revelation. And if people would just get and read the Bible and read the book of revelations. They would really.
And then all of a sudden, Curtis comes in with his racial slurs and starts screaming, and it's kind of this crazy beginning. I'm curious what your impression was of the song itself as you get right to the beginning of it.
Sisters, niggas, whiteys, Jews.
All that kind of put a big smile on my face because I just love the idea of somebody pushing the boundaries, and obviously the boundaries in 1970 are so incredibly pushed back farther behind than they are now. So for a guy to come out and just start throwing those terms out had to have been pretty ballsy and pretty risky. But even beyond that is that insane scream. Now I'm a big rock fan, and there's nothing more than I love than a big rock scream. I mean, there's so many examples, and I won't go through them all, but there's so many examples of these great rock screams. And I got to be honest with you, even though this isn't a rock song, I got to put this scream up against any of the great rock and roll screams of all time because it is fantastic.
Yeah, what's kind of weird about that is he's known as like this very gentle singer. He has a very mild kind of impression that he leaves with people. Most of the contemporaries at the time spoke about his falsetto and some of his very mild vocal qualities. And that's kind of what he's known for, particularly the impressions. It's very smooth and silky kind of singing. And then his first song on his first solo album, he's screaming racial epithets at people and then giving this, like you say, monstrous, like super aggressive scream. It's like a heavy metal kind of scream. It's totally out of character, and I think that was part of what he was going for. Was he kind of wanted to shake people up, kind of like you said, punch them in the gut a little bit. Why did he go in this direction? And one of the things I was reading about, which I didn't know about before this, was the great Isaac Hayes album from 1969 called Hot Buttered Soul, which, you know, I know the songs on it. I didn't know it as an album. When I looked it up, I realized there's only 3 or 4 songs on it, and one of them is a song I'm really familiar with, which is his cover of Burt Bacharach and Dionne Warwick's Walk On By, which, I mean, everybody should take a listen to this. It's an amazing song. Totally different style, of course. It's Isaac Hayes from, you know, Chef from South Park and Shaft doing a Burt Bacharach song. It makes no sense.
If you see me walking down the street and I start to cry each time we meet and walk on by, walk on by.
And he also does a cover of the Glenn Campbell classic, By the Time I Get to Phoenix, which is this really slow ballad about, you know, a guy and missing his wife. And so they're both very strange.
Oh, she'll hear, oh, the phone keep right on ringing and ringing and ringing and ringing, oh, and ringing.
What he did was create this other song, which I hope we can listen to here, which is called Hyperbolic Syllablex Sesquidaily Mystic. It's all one big word, all those letters all together, jammed together. And it had this groovy bass vibe, which I read a review of this Curtis Mayfield song that said that it was kind of directly influenced by this Isaac Hayes album, and particularly this song. And you know, I knew the song vaguely, but I went back and listened to it in preparing for this podcast, and I can see where those were connected. And it's just it's just an amazing album.
I can't sleep at night, but that's all right.
This wouldn't be the last time, like I said, Superfly and Shaft are kind of connected in a lot of ways, and I think that for me, the reason why this song in particular jumps out is because it's trying to bridge that gap between the hopeful people get ready 60s style civil rights stuff with some of the deeper stuff that came after it, stuff like Marvin Gaye's What's Going On, Stevie Wonder's Music of My Mind, and Talking Book, and some of the Intervisions, some of the other really socially aware soul and R&B and funk music from the early 70s. And one of my favorite is Bobby Womack's Across 110th Street, also from a movie. There's just a whole slew of these kinds of great albums and great songs from this era, but this one was this bridge between the earlier stuff, influenced a little bit by the Isaac Hayes, and then kicked off this whole array of music that really changed the way that Black voices were talking about their issues as we moved into the 70s. And it's such a great transitional period, and the song itself is just unbelievable.
Sisters, brothers and the whiteys, blacks and the crackers, police and their backers, they're all political actors.
Well, the one thing that I wanted to find out from you was what your thoughts were as to who do you think he's talking to, because it seems like he's angry at both sides. It seems like he's angry at the culture that he's a part of, right? Where people are killing each other, people are smoking dope, they're not getting education. These are all lyrics in the song. But then at the same time, he even brings up Richard Nixon, and Nixon saying, don't worry, don't worry about any of this. And I'm wondering who you think he's talking to, because when I think about a song like this, I think about a guy that's advocating for the poor, the disaffected, but it sounds to me like he's also criticizing that group as well as criticizing the other side when he mentions Nixon, and I'm sure Nixon can also be kind of representative for the entire population of people that kind of were opposed to civil rights, or maybe a little maybe a little racist at the time. So who do you think he was talking to if you look at the lyrics?
Well, if you look at the first, it's not really a verse, but the first substantive part of the song after the opening, the intro, the lyric is very explicit. Sisters, brothers, and the whiteys, blacks and the crackers, police and their backers, they're all political actors. I think you hit it right on the head, and I think this is the point I was trying to make a little bit ago about the distinction between this album and Curtis Mayfield in general, and some of the other stuff that came before it, and even some of the stuff that was out simultaneously. It was really about those other songs and albums and artists were talking about just what was happening. Where with Curtis, you have a real departure from just kind of stating the obvious or keeping it real or kind of representing the city scene. He's critiquing it, and he's not afraid to critique, like you say, his own people. And I think this is where, when you compare Shaft with Superfly, this is the big dichotomy, where the distinction is that in Superfly's case, he is really aggressively attacking the drug dealers, the pushers, the users. The police are responsible for their part. The political the powerful political entities in his communities are responsible for what they are responsible for. But he is very directly and aggressively critiquing his own community, saying we have to do better. We have to behave differently. And it's not a simple matter for him. It's a very complicated thing. And I think this song really covers that by exactly the point you made. He's taking time to make sure everybody's included. If there's hell below, we're all gonna go.
And if there's hell below, we're all gonna go.
It's just this ridiculously rich and thick combination of horns, right? There's this beautiful horn line.
Use the pill and the dope. Educated fool.
The strings, which create this great background, and there's the strings have their own hook. And then there's the traditional R&B arrangements, guitar, drums, keyboard, bass, of course, huge bass.
Brothers and the whitest, blacks and the crackers.
The progressive percussion to me is so great, right? There's percussion that's regular drum kit, but there's like a bongo sound that's going on, and a Congo drum that's going on that's great, and the bass coming from the keyboard, right? So there's a bass line at the beginning that comes in. The very first thing you hear, even before you hear the spoken portions, you hear this great keyboard bass line that's just really a great hook to bring you into the vibe of the song. And it's a template of sorts, for the kind of sound of funk and soul that we saw in the rest of the 70s. He definitely wasn't the first to come up with this sound, but I think he created his own version, and you hear it again and again in all the songs that followed in the rest of the 1970s.
Well, if you're talking about the actual music, I found one of the interesting things was, and there's a lot of covers of this song, the most interested I was in a punk band called Anti-Scene, which covered this song on a 2001 album called Hell. And it turns out to be a pretty good rock song. And Anti-Scene is a punk band, but they actually turned this into a little bit of a grungy rock pseudo heavy metal song. And the lick actually works as a rock song, which I actually really dug to know that this song translates not only to this genre, but to other genres as well.
Yeah, I was surprised by that. You found that, send it over to me. When I listened to it, I had to be honest. I was a little skeptical. I was like, "Oh, come on! What is this he's sending me? Some stupid punk band doing a version? And why is he making me listen to this?" And I put it on. First place, I totally agree with you. It makes for a great punk/rock song. I don't really think it was that punk. It was more of a mainline rock song to my view. But
no, you're right. Anti-Scene is supposed to be a punk band, but this specific song is more just like a straightforward hard rock song.
But what was surprising was that, despite the fact that totally different style and instrumentation, it was what I would call a faithful representation of the song. So in other words, when you switch to these different instruments and fast forward 30 years and do the song over again in this totally different style with different artists and everything, it still feels like the original song in a lot of ways. It doesn't lose any of the punch or potency from the groovy kind of bassy piece that's there. It lives through to this song as well. It doesn't get lost. It wasn't like it was flattened somehow or turned into some 3-chord, garage version. It stands up as a lush, kind of rich song in the rock genre.
So the postscript to Curtis Mayfield's career and his life was marred with quite a bit of tragedy. In 1990, he was actually performing on stage in Brooklyn when lighting equipment fell right on top of him and paralyzed him from the neck down. And that just kind of started his descent. He died in 1999 at the age of 57 from diabetes, but the health problems really started with that accident in 1990. And what I thought was amazing, and I'm going to have to go back and really give this a listen to, his very last album, which is called New World Order, was recorded with him lying flat on his back in his bed, unable to move, and they recorded his vocal tracks line by line. And I haven't listened to it yet, but I can't wait to hear what that sounds like, because that sounds like that's quite a feat and would probably be an emotional listen to know that here's a guy that can't move anything from the neck down, going to all that trouble to record another album. So he did have a lot of tragedy at the end of his life, but his legacy is quite incredible. There's a tribute album to him that was recorded, And some of the artists that recorded were Aretha Franklin, B.B. King, Rod Stewart, Phil Collins, Stevie Wonder, Elton John. So just that group of people that got together to record a tribute album to him kind of shows you how important he was as an artist and American history. And that really does put him up there with one of the most respected artists of the 60s and 70s.
Another thing I think I want to mention was it would be a mistake to not talk about these next 4 tracks that followed this song on this debut album. There are 4 of my favorite songs that they are all together in a 5-song run on his first album is really amazing. It kind of reminds me a little bit of The Stranger from Billy Joel, where you have this run of songs that you just cannot believe occurred naturally on an album, that you're not listening to a greatest hits album. So the next song that follows Don't Worry is The Other Side of Town, which is a very sad song. The Makings of You, which is a kind of a ballad. It's a romantic song. But then We People Who Are Darker Than Blue is a song that every person should listen to. It's absolutely amazing. We almost did that song instead of this one. I had trouble deciding. That's how much I love both of these songs.
We people who are darker than blue. This ain't no time for segregating. I'm talking about brown and yellow too.
But then the 5th song in this little, what I call the Curtis opening suite of songs, is Move On Up, which is a huge hit. It was used in movies, and it's become a bigger hit in the years since it was released. It was actually a really big album and single in England, and it's risen in popularity over the years. But these 5 songs together represent a run of songs that I can just put on and put on repeat and listen to over and over again. They are so diverse and rich and moving and of such an incredible quality that I just never get sick of them. And I listen to them frequently as one thing. It's unusual for me to put this on and just pick out 1 or 2 of those songs. I generally put them on all together and listen to them as one piece of music.
Just move on up. Move on up. But move on up. Watch out, but just move on up.
All right, episode 4 is in the books. We discussed a little social equality and the fight for racial justice in the 60s and 70s. We would love to hear from you. You can hit us up at songvoyage.net on the internet. Check us out on Twitter at songvoyage. We'd love to hear your thoughts, suggestions for songs you'd like to hear us talk about. I am up next, and I already have the song picked out, and I am positive it is going to blow Mitch's mind, a song he's never heard before, on what I consider to be the greatest heavy metal album of all time. We are going to discuss that next time. Mitch, I want to thank you very much for picking this song. You have any final thoughts?
No, I'm looking forward to it. Hope you blow my head away.
I hope so too. For Mitch Oster up in the Bay Area, I am Todd Villalobos in San Diego. See you next time.